Principal McCrae and friends, what a great delight it is to me to be part of the succession of lecturers in this Hayward Lectureship. Many of the names that are listed as predecessors are people whom I know and whom I admire. And I'm humbled to be invited to stand in that line of men who have spoken to you of the things of the faith in this lectureship. I am so pleased to be able to renew my acquaintance of about 30 years with Principal and Mrs. McCrae, and particularly to hear the English language spoken without any accent whatsoever. I was tempted to reply in broad Scots, but the only bit of broad Scots that I know is a poem in which an old Scottish poacher reflects on a news bulletin that he read in the Scotsman about a person who had poached two rhinoceros in Africa and was absolutely staggered. He had poached some pheasants and partridges and had talked with the keeper with a couple of salmon hanging down his trouser legs and so forth. But the idea that anyone could poach a rhinoceros was an amazing thing to him. But my California tongue can't quite make it around those Scottish trills, and the subject of poaching is probably not entirely apposite to this lecture series. So I will forego a Scottish response and only tell my friends Andrew and Jean how pleased I am to be here with them and to see the kind of ministry to which the Lord has called them in this place. I'm grateful for the greetings of the principal of the university and for the privilege of being a guest on this distinguished campus. More than anything, I am delighted to see the Divinity College, which has meant so much to this part of your nation, and indeed has had worldwide influence in sending out persons trained in the proclamation of the gospel, in the spreading of the faith, the nurturing of the church, the care of needy men and women. To be here and to see the place of which I have heard for so many years is a great privilege for me. As we look at this dialogue with a desperate preacher, there are three questions that you're entitled to ask as we begin the series. The first is, why choose this specific topic? And the second is, what is the message of this preacher? Ecclesiastes. And the third is, how are we going to approach our particular study? Why the topic? That's the first question. After all, wisdom literature comprises a narrow section of Old Testament literature when you compare it with the law or the history or the Psalms, the prophets that loom so large on the pages of the Old Testament. And Ecclesiastes is only one brief burst of wisdom compared to the prolonged salvos of heavy artillery found in Job and Proverbs. Let me try three brief answers to this question. Why the topic? First is the baffling character of the book. Few Old Testament writings have produced such a flurry of opinions as to how they should be read, what they mean, as Ecclesiastes has. The ancient preacher blazed a trail of obscurity in delivery that too many of us, as his modern progeny, have followed. Trying to puzzle out the major themes of his message is a task that's tantalizing, frustrating, and yet important. Partial success is all we can hope for. But that's the case in almost everything we do in life, isn't it? Second is the scriptural role of the book. It is, and has been for more than 2 millennia, and will continue to be, a part of Scripture. There are only 66 such parts. This can mean nothing less than that we must take each part with great seriousness. Ecclesiastes may not be Genesis, Isaiah, Acts, or Ephesians, but it is part of God's Word, demanding our attention, insisting on our study, and compelling our involvement. Our commitment to the whole counsel of God is suspect if we omit from our circle of interest any part of the received and preserved and prescribed list of biblical writings. Third, may I mention the present usefulness of the book. Turn a secular and reasonably intellectual audience loose on the Bible, and if they can riffle their way through the Old Testament far enough, they will latch on to Ecclesiastes as their kind of stuff. It will speak to their needs, march to their cadence, voice their outlook. Koheleth's question, does life have meaning, is their kind of question. Besides, his dread of death captures their mood precisely. As Fulton Sheen once said, death is the taboo of modern society as sex was the taboo of Victorian. I wondered how to define taboo, and I thought maybe this would be a definition: what genteel people do not discuss at tea parties. Can you hear the cups rattle and see the starched collars wilt if someone in Eton or Belgrave Square asked a Victorian matron about her sex life? The same sense of dread would shroud a party in Beverly Hills if someone injected, "I hear Shirley has cancer. How long do you think she'll live?" The death rate in Beverly Hills, like everywhere else, is 100%. And Koheleth insists that we recognize that. Furthermore, his warnings about overvaluing the techniques of wisdom or the pleasures of materialism have volumes to say to our modernity, where most of us are yuppies at heart. Some of us are muppies, middle-aged, upwardly mobile professionals. I can only qualify for middle age if I intend to live to 116. So I'm an oopie, an old, upwardly mobile professional. We're all of this at the heart, though we prefer to hang that label on other people. But the Old Testament offers no clearer mirror to face us with our foibles than the 12 chapters of Ecclesiastes. Second question you're entitled to ask: what is the message? This question triggers a rapid-fire survey of approaches to the book's interpretation. Simply put, the basic issue is whether the preacher is personally proclaiming the verdict that all is futility, vanity is the traditional reading of that, or whether the preacher is stating it so as to refute it. Is he the skeptic, or are his hearers? Is he confessing his own inability to find meaning in life, or exposing that of others? The array of scholarly opinions on each side of these questions is so impressive that no glibness is tolerable. And the opinions are varied because the flow of the book itself is perplexing. Passages which devalue wisdom are placed back to back with those that treasure it. Conclusions about the futility of all things crowd close against summaries of how to live with some measure of success. Demonstration of life's irregularities rubs shoulders with collections of proverbs that claim predictable results. Time was when these themes and their counterparts were called contradictions by some of the rabbis, or credited to a series of redactors by early 20th century scholars. Time was, I say, because most recent students have decided to take the book as it is. doubting that an editor would try either to slap orthodox patches on a cynical book or insert huge doses of skepticism into a pious one. But treating the book as a unity has not eased all the problems. We're left with the matter of sudden mood changes, rapid vacillations from world-denying to world-affirming statements. Is Koheleth arguing with himself, contesting his own faith, or battling his own doubt? Or does he face opponents whose views he cites in order to refute them? The mood and message will be sharply different depending on how we answer such questions. The third reason for the topic, the third introductory question that you have a right to ask: how will we approach our subject? We'll approach it with 4 assumptions about the book. Assumptions which will form the framework of the rest of this first lecture. Ecclesiastes has crisis as its motivation. That's the first assumption. It has continuity as its method. That's the second assumption. It has conflict as its mood. Third assumption, it has canon as its mooring. Fourth assumption. There we are then. That's our outline for the rest of the lecture. Assumption 1. Ecclesiastes has crisis as its motivation. The crisis is the product of at least 2 influences: the preacher's historical setting and the preacher's intellectual climate. Before we explore these courses, perhaps we should anticipate their result. The nature of the crisis itself, as the pages of Ecclesiastes enable us to piece it together. The crisis can be understood as the vacuum caused by the seeming absence of God and the overarching arrogance of religious teachers who sought to fill that vacuum with simple formulae for happiness and mechanical explanations of divine behavior. It's to point out the nature of the crisis and the way beyond it that the preacher preaches. The preacher's historical setting, we'll take that first, helps shape the crisis. All evidence points to a late colonial period in Jewish history for the preacher's setting. The final decades of the 2 centuries of Persian dominance, or the early stages of the Seleucid regime. Remember, that's the Syrian part of Alexander's fragmented empire after that empire split in the 320s. Those are the eras in view: late Persian or early Seleucid, somewhere between 400 and 300. Even without pinpoint precision, it's safe to reckon that the southern kingdom of Judah had undergone nearly 3 centuries without independence, while the northern territory of Israel had felt the boot of conquerors for over 400 years. Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, and Greeks, in a sequence that led to increasing paganization in the life of God's people. Now lay that timeline, 300 to 400 years, on the history of our continent, and it will mark off a period almost as long as Europeans have lived on the banks of the St. Lawrence or the coasts of Virginia. What could this mean for large segments of the citizenry but loss of power, only faded memories of independence, absence of a sense either of national history or of national destiny? And as we'll see in more detail, this historical setting had all but robbed the people and most of the leaders of the vibrant sense of life before God that pulsates, say, in the Old Testament Psalms. If we look for a moment at the preacher's intellectual climate as well as his historical setting, we see that helped the crisis even more than the place in history did. The forces that make for spiritual renewal were at a low ebb in that period. We can guess that the priests had increasingly degenerated into religious functionaries who barely observed the letter of the law, never mind the spirit. Malachi, more than a century earlier, had spotted this trend and argued against it. We have little evidence that prophets were active to recall people to covenant loyalty and revive their hope in a salvation still to come. And apocalyptists had not yet arrived on the scene in full force to alert the people to their special chosenness and to forecast with mystic symbols the downfall of the heathen and the vindication of the righteous. Nor had renewal and protest communities like Qumran been formed to relight the torch of hope, faith, and discipline. What we do see, and what Koheleth seemed to know best, is a wisdom movement during this period. A wisdom movement staffed by heirs to the wise who left their stamp on the book of Proverbs and the Psalms of wisdom. The intensity with which the preacher hammers at premises of the wisdom movement suggests that it was strongly institutionalized and therefore well defended. Its stock in trade was tradition and formulae, which cabined divine freedom, which oversimplified the complexities of life, and which frequently promised what they could not deliver. Hartmut Geza has described the tension for Koheleth in terms of a breakdown for him of the accepted patterns of cause and effect which play such a key role in the Proverbs. To the older wise, prosperity was a de facto proof of righteousness. Poverty, a de facto evidence of wickedness or folly. Koheleth says no. Both injustice and death have severed for him that neat causal tie on which so much of the conventional wisdom was based. The end result of all this historical ennui and intellectual narrowness was a sterile religiosity that could spawn only an accompanying secular hedonism. True spiritual goals abandoned, large segments of the populace, especially the upper classes to whom Koheleth probably belonged, sought satisfaction in material and sensual pleasures made possible by their commercial enterprises. If you're aware of the text of Ecclesiastes, you realize how much commercial language is used there. He knows the parlance of the Wall Street Journal of his day, and he loads his book with the language of commerce. Whether in its pious or in its secular guise, this arrogance became the object of Koheleth's unmasking. Divine freedom, underscore that. And the limits of human understanding, underscore that. Divine freedom and the limits of human understanding were at stake for him in the same way they were at stake for the author of Job. Both were in crisis. The old formulae which they knew so well and perhaps themselves had taught had been shattered on the anvil of personal experience, and the scattered fragments had to be reforged into better tools to deal with life as it really is. A recent interpretation, that of J.A. Loder, published in 1979, refines and details the crisis along the following lines. Let me just walk through the steps with you. First, post-exilic Jews found God pushed into the distance, partly by their circumstances that have been already noted, and partly by the increasing awe in which they held the one God, an awe which avoided the name Yahweh and more used surrogate expressions, heaven, the high, the majesty, the glory, to describe and address God. The sense of his immanent presence and involvement in their lives was dulled. Step 2, a vacuum ensued as God was perceived as increasingly remote. 3, into this vacuum were brought numbers of intermediaries. Among the chief were wisdom, treated as a personality virtually separated from God, what we sometimes refer to as the hypostasis of wisdom, treating wisdom as an independent entity spun off from the person of God. Others of these intermediaries were the Word, or the voice of God, which was described in the Hebrew phrase bat kol, the daughter of a voice. The Spirit, the name, and the Shekinah, presence or glory. Step 4, the gap was thus bridged to the remote deity. Here's God pushed to be remote by the circumstances of the intellectual and religious life of the time. And this gap to his remoteness was bridged by the intermediate expressions of his power. They kept him in touch with his flock. And thus the tension caused by the remoteness was not truly felt. The conventional wise did not experience the crisis in the same way that Kohelet did. Jabbing them awake to feel the crisis, then, was a large part of his mission. The preacher felt the crisis. That's step 5. He shared the prevalent sense of remoteness, but found no place for the intermediaries. The 6th and last step, he lived in tension then between the older wisdom on which he was reared and the over-dogmatizing of that older wisdom, which he cannot now accept. It's that tension, or something like it, that accounts for the remarkable assaults of Kohelet on the teaching of his colleagues and his persistent attempts to show a better, if more modest, way. In any case, we understand him best, in my judgment, if we see crisis as his motivation. That's our first assumption. Assumption 2. Ecclesiastes has continuity as its method. The preacher is a wise man, occupied with the role and meaning of wisdom. It's one of his prime subjects, mentioned something like 50 times in the book. It's a chief point of his interaction with his fellow sages. The difference between their handling of the topic and his becomes a chief bone of contention, as we shall shortly see. The preacher, in continuity with the wise, also believes in the centrality of the created order. The order, power, beauty, and justice of the creation were at the heart of how the wise saw life, as the book of Proverbs illustrates. You will not understand the book of Proverbs unless you see it as the standardization and systematizing of the way in which the creation works. Not only was wisdom present at the creation as Yahweh's playful offspring, read that in Proverbs 8, but wisdom was also to be discerned in the patterns of animal life, so that industry could be learned from the ant. Go to the ant, thou sluggard. And cooperative togetherness could be learned from the locusts. The locusts have no king, remember, but they travel in bands. That's better than Baptists do. Beyond that, the creation, charged as it was with Yahweh's power and presence, was the arena of blessing or punishment, depending on whether human behavior was wise, that is, was righteous. Wise and righteous are synonyms in the Proverbs. Or was foolish, that is, wicked. Wisdom and folly are synonyms in the Proverbs. Kohelet saw creation from a somewhat different angle, but he held it to be no less important, with no apparent doctrine of covenant or redemption to sustain him. He clung tenaciously to his view of God as Creator. Remember his last words with which he introduces chapter 12. Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth. Like the other sages, in continuity with them, the preacher gleaned his knowledge from experience. He doesn't do battle with the wise using weapons of revealed law. In fact, by commandments at the end of the book, his pupil doesn't mean the 10 words of the Mosaic law. He doesn't use prophetic audition or apocalyptic vision. He says continually, I saw, I found, in his reflections, his eyewitness observations. And he counters their experience-based proverbs with anti-proverbs of his own coining, equally derived from experience. To put it in the technical language of philosophy, it was not their epistemology that he questioned, but the selectiveness of that epistemology and their overgeneralizing of evidence gained from such selectivity. Finally, on this point, the preacher's means of arguing were identical to those of the conventional teachers. Virtually every literary form that he uses, from reflection, that extended first-person account of what he's seen and discovered, to simple proverb, from antithesis, those back-to-back statements that disagree with each other or that give negative and positive sides of a question in the couplets, from antithesis to comparison, all the better proverbs that Ecclesiastes uses, from parable, story of the king in a city, to allegory, the picture of old age at the end of the book, from rhetorical question to summary appraisal. All of those standard forms are found in the book of Proverbs and Job before him, and in the apocryphal writings of Sirach and Wisdom, not to speak of the New Testament words of Jesus and James, who were sages in their own way, after him. The preacher's use of such forms is not just a matter of strategy, fighting the enemy with his own weapons, using their techniques. It's a matter of necessity. Given his times, his setting, his training, and especially the state of his faith, these techniques of discerning reality through observation were all he had. He had no place to go beyond them, no other tools with which to work. So steeped is Koheleth in the ways of wisdom, that it's probably accurate, in fact, to call his entire book a mashal, a lesson, a piece of instruction, and an extended proverb, if you will, a mashal on what life means and does not mean. We shall not catch who he is or how he thinks unless we see continuity in his method. He uses the same types of argumentation that the wise men use whom he is refuting. Assumption 3. Ecclesiastes has conflict as its mood. Loder's way of labeling the opposing sides is apt. He says it's a contest between Koheleth's protesting wisdom and the dogmatized wisdom of the conventional teachers. If Loder's analysis of the polarities, and that's the theme of his book, the placing of opposite views side by side in a dozen or so themes in an equal number of literary forms, if that analysis is even half right, then this conflict is the core of the book. And three of its aspects, conflict in regard to meaning in life, is there profit? Conflict in regard to the question of freedom for human beings, and conflict in the issue of hope beyond death. Three of those aspects will provide the key subjects of the lectures that build on this introduction. Since we shall look at these together at length, we can spare ourselves a thorough canvas now and be content with a shorthand sketch. The value of everything good is a major issue in this conflict. We want to look at the steps in the conflict right now. The value of everything good is a major issue in the conflict. Wisdom, wealth, achievement on which to ground wisdom, wealth, achievement, pleasure are not seen by the preacher as ultimate foundations on which to ground one's life. when treated as absolutes, that's the key, not their relative value, but when treated as absolutes, they cave in under the weight of expectation placed upon them and become clear examples of life's futility. However precious the authors who assembled the book of Proverbs deemed wisdom to be, its value for Kohelet was only relative. Wisdom's value, only relative. Certainly it's better than folly, but it cannot legitimately be peddled as the chief key to life. There is too much mystery beyond its reach, too much divine freedom beyond its ken. The outlook on the creation is another issue of conflict. We've already seen how the traditional wisdom treasured the creation as a school of wisdom and a court of justice. For Kohelet, however, it seemed locked into weary routines. Even more, it was so totally regulated by the decree of God that human choice and endeavor left no impact on it. It revealed not so much the glory of God, as the psalmist says creation does, as the grimness of God, who, tight-fisted and thin-lipped, seemed to control all our times and seasons, to the preacher. Third area of conflict, the views of death, which sharpened that conflict. The sages saw it as the release of the human spirit to make its home with God. How do you know? Queried Kohelet. Can you prove that human destiny after death differs from that of dogs? Experience gives us no handle on that question. The matter of divine justice was a further point of debate. The older teachers assumed a just universe governed by a just God. The younger preacher peppered this proposition with case studies best based on his own investigation, which convinced him of inexplicable elements of whimsy and caprice in the divine order. Finally, in this area of conflict, definition of the good marked one of the points of fiercest controversy. Kohelet was convinced that both the wise and the seekers after fame, wealth, and pleasure had higher hopes for satisfaction and for fulfillment in life than his reading of this warranted. Scale back your expectations, was his counsel. Find joy in ordinary activities like eating, drinking, working, making love to your spouse. See these normal human pursuits as gifts of the Creator. Our appetites for them are His work. The opportunity to enjoy them is an act of His grace. We go back to that statement about no automatic cause and effect relationship any longer available to Kohelet. For him, as Professor Geza says, well-being must be a direct judicial gift of God to the individual. So he brings in the elements of the grace in the ordinary in place of the automatic techniques of wisdom with their guaranteed results that the older wise had propagated. Kohelet saw the world differently from those old colleagues of his. For him it was a world less tidy, more cramped, less friendly, less promising than conventional wisdom assumed. The conflict was constant, and at very basic levels of life. It permeates the book and accounts more than any other factor for its prevalent mood. Its mood is conflict. Fourth and last assumption, Assumption 4, Ecclesiastes has canon as its mooring. It sits secure among the books of wisdom, preserved in the Scripture, and wants to be seen, as do all other books, in terms of what it contributes to the faith and life of God's people. As we look at its role in the canon, we have to see, first of all, the basic unity of the book. One of the gains in scholarship over the past 2 decades is a tendency to look at biblical writings as we now have them in completed form. Of course, we want to learn as much as possible of how they were formed, what stages can be discerned in their composition, what sources may have contributed to their makeup. But it's even more important to grasp the message, the role, and the purpose of the book as a whole. Apart from the final verses, that is verses 9 to 14 of chapter 12, where a disciple of Koheleth describes the preacher's work, the book can be understood as a unity and has been with more and more consensus among contemporary scholars. But its unity can only be comprehended as we understand its method of arguing. It begins with the announcement of its basic conclusion. It starts where most books would end. Everything in life is futility, in the sense that it's been overvalued and cannot be depended on as ground for security, satisfaction, or hope. That theme is demonstrated with a whole chain of evidences drawn from Kohelet's personal observations. It's reinforced with clusters of proverbs that show the emptiness of conventional wisdom and counsel the hearers in how to make the best of life, hard as it is. And it's punctuated with the conclusions that urge people to set modest expectations for themselves and enjoy God's simple everyday gifts of food, drink, work, and love. Some such picture of the unity of Ecclesiastes sets the stage for our discussion of its contribution to the canon. The restoration of balance is one of its uses. Proverbs as a literary genre necessarily oversimplify and overgeneralize. I don't know if there are any traffic lights in Wolfville. I haven't had a chance to look around enough yet. But if there were, and I had one of you escorting me on each side, and the light turned yellow, one of you could urge me forward across the street, quoting to me the timeless wisdom of haste, or of he who hesitates is lost. And the other could hold me back while the light turned red and reinforce that decision with the equally timeless statement, haste makes waste.